in changing their practices?
So did you get that?
Yeah, sure. So the next question was talk about trade associations and how they might be impeding progress in this area. I think that's a great question, and for better or worse, trade associations are out there often defending what I would call the lowest common denominator. So you don't get a lot of bold leadership, in my view. That comes often at the individual brand level, where a big, iconic brand will go out and make a commitment. But often the trade associations are there to running defense, basically. They're there to protect the brand and be very conservative about the status quo. So we found in the work on extended producer responsibility, you had the Grocery Manufacturers Association pretty much doing all the work to deter state-level legislation, and the brands could kind of let the trade associations do that unpleasant work, and the brands kept a low profile. So yeah, it is, I would say that's why we don't do that. We go right to the brands, and we try to get the brands on record. So the trade associations are, sometimes you just have to try to work around them.
So
if I could respond to that too, public policy, I think Conrad's right, and I know the trade association guys, they hate, and gals, hate to be branded as defending the lowest common denominator, but essentially that's generally what they do in public policy settings. And what we find is that if you can get one company, it doesn't take a lot. Oftentimes it's just one major company to break from the herd. It can really confuse the legislators, right? Because when the legislators see environment on one side and business on the other, it's business all the time, right? In this political climate, they're going to go with business all the time. But as soon as one company breaks from the herd, or if you get, even better, more than one company that starts to break from the herd. I just want to give a quick example. Back in 2003, 2004, I was working on some of the first extended producer responsibility laws for electronics in my home state of Maine. And at that point, the entire IT and television industry was completely opposed to this idea that they should have to pay to finance the collection and recycling systems for their products. And through a dialogue process, Hewlett-Packard decided that they saw the handwriting on the wall in Europe, and they said, we've got a recycling facility here in the United States. We think we can get ahead of this. And they broke from the herd, and they joined with us in Maine. And it was local governments, the environmental community, and one major company against the rest of the IT and TV industry, which, by the way, bought up all of the corporate lobbyists in the state of Maine to kill this bill. But it was enough to convince the leading Republican senator that was on that committee to say, who was a waste and recycling guy, who knew that the landfill that he had created couldn't deal with any more of this toxic waste coming in. It was enough to convince him that this was the right thing to do, and that would not have happened were it not for a big brand saying, we think this is the right thing to do. We want to stand out in front. We recognize that everybody else in our industry is on the other side, but we're going to do this anyway. So that's the exact kind of leadership we need. I think we were working in a number of state legislatures where we were bringing the environmental community together around it. We were bringing local governments together around it. And Nestle Waters was coming in to support the bill, but we had hoped that they could bring some other big consumer brands. And I think what happened is other consumer brands would not come to the table. And their packaging suppliers, there's a number of packaging suppliers that are quietly supportive of extended producer responsibility for packaging. The aluminum folks want their aluminum back, right? 38% recycling rate, you saw it in Conrad's slides for aluminum. It's one of the most valuable materials in the recycling stream. They want that back, right? Tetra Pak, those guys, they want their cartons, right? And so there's, and the PET recycling industry, they're hungry to get those bottles. And so, but they can't get ahead of their customers, right? So we know that, for example, that Alcoa was, and the glass industry was supporting bottle bill legislation. And then you had Coca-Cola threatening to pull their contracts with Alcoa and the Glass Association if they kept supporting these bottle bills. And so, what we found was really just a falling out of the kinds of consumer brand support that we needed to really move it forward. Now, there are a couple of states where I still think it's there's a possible viability of something happening. And I mentioned California. There's a couple states in New England. Minnesota has had a discussion that's gone on about extended producer responsibility. But I want to just quickly mention California. Several years ago, CalRecycle, which is the state regulatory agency for recycling, went out and they created what's called the Manufacturer's Challenge. And they basically went out to the consumer brands and they said, look, we've got a 75% recycling target on the books. We're hovering somewhere around 52, 53%. Much of what's left is your packaging. So what are you going to do about it? We want to do extended producer responsibility. And they said, no, we don't make us do extended producer responsibility. We'll come up with something. Well, year and a half passes, and they didn't bring anything that was viable to the table. And CalRecycle said, we're moving forward with the mandatory packaging policy. They've just had their first workshop last month. And we have our packaging policy directors currently working with local governments and nonprofit groups to support that process and get the best kind of policy. And we have a lot of high hopes because the folks in the regulatory agency, they've tried everything else. They have the blessing of the administration, and they want to move that forward. So we'll see what comes out of it, but we have high hopes for it.
I'd just add 2 quick points to that. I think that's a great summation. The first is that I think we need to look north to a very successful rollout of the first in North America of a 100% packaging industry-paid program in British Columbia. Within a couple of years, I think they're over 70%, which is, I don't think anyone thought this would happen this fast. And so you should look at the BC program. It's not perfect, but they've done a pretty darn good job of rolling this out. And I just learned at one of the meetings in Sacramento a couple weeks ago that they are recycling all of their plastic domestically. They're not sending any of it to Asia, which is not what California, we're sending most of it to Asia. We haven't figured that out. So BC has figured out a way, and that deals with a bunch of social and environmental problems that you're putting on the developing world if you can figure that out. So kudos to BC. I think it's a model maybe we can look to. I guess the second learning was that of all this work is that a 100% producer pays model was almost like a third rail here. It got a lot of people upset. And I think what we have to do is look to see what politically and culturally we can accept here, and there's probably some kind of a shared model to be determined. And I know the shared model hasn't worked great in parts of Ontario, but I think it was always going to be a uniquely American model, and I'm hopeful that a shared model can get us some traction.
The other thing about the BC model that's interesting for folks here in the room is that they've also found ways to collect a lot of low-value plastics and find markets for them, which here in the United States, because we haven't had the kinds of investment that we need in our recycling system, it's just hasn't been economically possible. But because you're getting that business investment in the recycling system in BC, I mean, they are recycling all kinds of materials and products that aren't being recycled anywhere in the U.S.
So Trish had a nice term, which I don't hear too much in the U.S., which is offshoring your recycling. Do you use that term here?
I thought it was great.
So, there's 2 ways to look at that. One is what Conrad just mentioned, which is we're exporting our waste to be recycled somewhere else where there's lower labor cost. But another way is all the packaging you just talked about and the exporting of that just through normal product exports, for example, to an island where they don't have the capacity to off-take it from that island or recycle it. Is there any discussion about that in the industry and the multinationals of how to send appropriately recoverable material to those places as with their products, or is that not even a discussion yet?
I haven't seen it. I don't think we're that far down the road. I think there's an element of folks who feel like this is free markets. The ships that come into Oakland, near where I live, that laden with all the goods from Asia, they they go back empty unless they take back, in general, a lot of, well, they take back some autos, but they take back a lot of waste fairly cheaply. And so there's, in California, it's, in some cases, they have outbid, what the domestic market is willing to pay. And, we've had these talks with Coke and Pepsi for years. Why can't you get more post-consumer resin? And they're not willing to pay sometimes as much as traditionally some of the other countries have. But with the green fence, maybe that'll change.
Okay, I think there was a question back here.
Hi, my name is Anna Clark. I live here in Dallas. I'm also here as a sustainability consultant, but I'm really curious as a resident. So I have a question I want to put to the panel, Doug, Matt, or Conrad, or any of you. So a couple years back, Dallas advocates managed to convince our city council to pass I think a 5-cent fee on plastic bags to use at the grocery store, and that did go through, but it ended up getting repealed because people were not happy about it. So then they considered a full plastic bag ban, and our city council, the majority of them said no to that, including our mayor.
Yeah.
So if you have a person like me who goes into a store to shop, at, for example, CVS, and one day they're asking if I want a bag, and then when you no longer have the policy in place that insists that they ask, they stop asking, and now they try to continue just bagging every little thing. It makes me wonder, as a consultant, why a retailer would not choose to lead to change behavior when they were already doing it.
Yeah.
So it's just very frustrating, and I want to understand. So are there some models or best practices I could know about as a consultant to ask my clients to consider in leading on the culture change side of things?
That's a great question. I heard about the Dallas bag ban, bag fee fiasco on my way over here from my taxi cab driver. I said, "What are you doing? What are you doing here?" I said, "We're here talking about plastic pollution." He said, "Oh, we had this disaster with our bag ban here." So, I think that in order for these policies really to work, they need public support. And one of the reasons why they've worked so well in California, I don't know if folks in the room are aware, but California just had, they passed a statewide bag ban. The plastics industry and the disposable shopping bag industry worked to overturn it. They had a very confusing citizens referendum process with 2 different citizens referendums. And the people of California voted to keep their bag ban, right? And a lot of it was because 70% of the population in California had already lived under jurisdictions that had plastic bag bans in place. And I think that, and there was a tremendous amount of public engagement and consumer engagement from the advocacy community throughout the state of California to make that happen. And so it was really a matter of generating public support, getting those local ordinances passed, and building the support for a statewide bag ban. And they were completely outgunned by the plastics industry in that fight, and yet they won. And so I think that public community engagement around things like bag bans is critically important, because otherwise you're not gonna get the support from the community for these things. And then to talk about what individual companies can do, one of the very first pieces of plastics-related legislation that I worked on was a plastic bag ban fee back in 2008 in my home state of Maine. And at that point, there was I don't know if I want to get too far down the weeds here, but I was going to tell you my story about my great Senator Nutting from Maine with his Maine accent, but I'm not going to do that. But what was interesting in that discussion is that the largest grocer in the state of Maine and regionally, the lobbyist for them came up to me while we were having this discussion. He said, "Look, I know the Grocers Association is totally opposed to this, and don't tell them I said this to you." But he said, "We support this. We can't publicly come out here and support this, but we support this. Giving bags away for free is a cost to us." And so we worked with them on an initiative it wasn't what we wanted, but we were able to work privately with them. Now in every single parking lot of these grocery stores, they have signs in the parking lot. They have signs when you go into the grocery store saying, turn around if you forgot your bags. And we got them to put the reusable bags up front at the register and not in some sad corner of the store where it was before. And I haven't checked in to see what impact that's had on their use of disposable shopping bags, but I have noticed in the grocery store a lot of people using reusable bags, and they're branded, and they get their brand recognition from that as well. So.
Okay, well, I think, did you have a quick one? We got a couple quick questions, and then we'll.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, especially in the context of that question, if one of you can comment on the trend towards preemption.
Towards what?
Preemption, the preemption bills.
Oh, preemption bills. Yeah, it's a sad reality that, well, some states like California are moving towards, or have continued to allow community rights that some of the more red states are choking off the ability of communities to determine if they want plastic bags or not. So I would think that's probably more of a question for the advocacy groups.
Yeah, so, Rachel's referring to, I think a really active campaign by folks in the plastics industry to pass state preemption laws that prevent local communities from passing things like plastic bag bans or styrofoam container bans. And the targets have largely been in red states, although they were successful in the state of New York in passing a bill that essentially overturned New York City's plastic bag ban. And so, we are very concerned about it. Those of us that are working on the policy side and the advocacy side on this, we're working to really start marshaling organizations throughout the country to be able to defend against these kinds of state preemption campaigns. And, it's really a trampling of community rights. And it's something that we're very, very much concerned about, and we're taking very, very seriously and are organizing around right now, because we think it should be up to communities to decide, what they feel is acceptable, and we want communities to be able to decide how they want to move forward with preventing this kind of pollution in their communities. So yeah, that's the answer. Thanks.
Okay, great. Trish, quick one, and then very quick answers, and then. Yeah, because Trish is all the way from Oz.
Well, I wanted to highlight and ask you your thoughts about this. In Australia, because we don't have extended producer responsibility, we have the covenant, which is the agreement for industry to fund initiatives. So when Doug said about remote locations and needing facilities, one of the things that we've been able to fund is a recycling facility on Cocos Islands. Cocos Islands is just sand, and it's miles from anywhere, and they have one service, I think one or two flight services a week. So their waste was going literally into the ocean.
Right.
So that's the way we've approached it, is not the extended producer responsibility, but rather a shared responsibility. Yep. Do you think that could work elsewhere?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we've explored a number of different extended producer responsibility models here in the United States. I've helped to write, I can't tell you how many different iterations of different models for EPR, with lots of different colleagues around the country, including folks from industry and the recycling industry. We have high hopes that something will shake out. And typically in the United States, we need one state to kind of be the first one to move forward. And after that, it's like the first domino falls. And usually, and oftentimes, it's not necessarily a giant state like California, which is 1/8 of the world's economy, right? It's usually smaller states that can function a little bit more like policy laboratories for the bigger states to follow afterwards. And when I was working in my teeny little state of Maine, it's actually big geographically but small population-wise. We were able to do that for a number of years. So yeah, I mean, I have high hopes for any kind of EPR model. I mean, I think ultimately what we want is for the companies that are complicit in generating all of this packaging and in the environmental problems that those cause to join in helping to finance and be part of the solutions to that. Really just not leaving that out to government and taxpayers and individuals to figure out what to do with all of this waste. So yes, the short answer is we have high hopes, and shared responsibility models, absolutely we can think work. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Conrad and Matt, and appreciate
Thanks.
a very good panel there.